Hello, everyone, and welcome to our April webinar. I'm Denise, your host, and with me to present is QAD and MRP expert and now celebrity, Don Lindsey. With much to cover, let's jump right into housekeeping as we do have a good number of new folks with us today. Those of you who are our regular attendees may have seen a version of this before, but let me impress our new folks at the risk of again embarrassing Don, who is a business analyst for several companies and has 18 years of QAD ERP experience. Throughout those years, Don has worked with 7 different versions of QAD, and in addition to his decades of hands-on experience, Don is becoming a YouTube sensation, hence his celebrity status.
Well, thank you, Denise, for that glowing introduction. What we had talked about previously last June and July webinars was kind of where MRP sits in relationship to ERP, and then we talked a little bit in finer detail about MRP's functional process. So today, what I thought we would do is spend a little bit of time talking about all of the specific fields and menus in QAD that make MRP work. So today, we'd like to talk about how to update the item master file, the data elements, so that they can optimize MRP. We'll talk a little bit about product structures, both BOMs and formulas, and how those run in MRP. Then I want to look at some functions that affect MRP, obviously sales orders, purchase orders, work orders, look at some processing in those areas and how MRP is going to react to that. Then we'll take a look at the transactions that affect MRP. And finally, we'll follow up with just a quick word about something called DD-MRP. So terminology is with everything that you do with any new area of subject or knowledge. There's a lot of new terms that you're probably going to have to become familiar with MRP, order policy, item status, structure, min-max, etc., etc. And that's just for a start. There's lots of information that we're going to be going through. So if you don't understand a particular term we use, you can always look it up in Google. QAD has the knowledge base, which is a wonderful tool for anyone who is on maintenance. And if you want, just send myself or Denise an email. I'll list my email address at the end, and we'll be glad to assist you. But remember, when you are dealing with any new process within QAD, it's good to have solid work instructions. Some companies have turnover, God forbid, and planners leave and new planners come on board, and it's a good idea to have some sort of document that shows how your particular organization deals with, in this case, MRP, and then a company data dictionary or a wiki of all the fields and values used by your companies. I don't know how many companies I've visited that have completely different ideas of what the order policies or item statuses or structure types mean. So as long as you define it for yourselves, I think you'll be in good shape. A little bit about history. We talked about this in June, but MRP is basically become the way of life for planning. It was conceived back in the 1950s. We used to use order policy or reorder points at EOQs, but when computers were invented, 3 gentlemen, Joe Orlicky, Oliver White, George Plossel, Vandermark was in there. They codified this process of taking a bill of material and exploding that through its product structures and giving the computer the ability to time phase requirements out across a planning horizon. It was basically commercialized in the 1970s, and by 1990s, most every company that had an ERP system has an MRP system. So it's really the way that all of us use MRP. Let's talk just a little bit about the structure of QED. QED has databases, which are basic currency, general ledger, calendars, startup accounts, and then there are domains. Domains represent the distinct business operation with a single currency and a chart of accounts. Then we've got entities below domains, and this doesn't really have a lot to do with MRP. It's basically part of the accounting process, but in the structure of the data, you have entities, and within entities, you have sites. Now, sites are important to MRP because that's where you do MRP, is at a site. If you've got site 10, which is a typical designation for site, you're going to run MRP in site 10. Or if you have multiple sites, so you're going to run MRP in those sites. So sites define records, places where you manufacture or store inventory. And then locations are places or specified areas within a particular site where inventory is stored. And it's stored and defines how inventory can be used at those particular locations. And we'll talk a little bit about that when we get to the inventory status process. But from an MRP point of view, location is critical because that's where your quantity on hand begins. The lot, the expiration dates, by location and site are the basis of how MRP processes the projected quantity on hand across the horizon. We'll talk a little bit more later about cycle counting, but cycle counting is that process where you ensure that those location quantities are accurate, because MRP needs that accurate beginning quantity on hand to do its job. There's control files. Control files determine how QED processes information having to do with particular functions. And you can see there's a shop floor control file, there's work order control file, there's MRP control, sales order, purchase order, inventory control. These all determine how you process information. It's important that you should review and understand every field in every control file and how it affects MRP and inventory. In the newer version of QED, that is the EE version, I don't know how many of you are using EE, but in EE, they had these new accounting control files. They split some of the functionality between the old control files and the new control files. So you've got to have some information in these inventory or these accounting control files that also are going to affect MRP. So let's talk about the item master file. As with any ERP system, the item master is the basic table required to establish a part. And as we go through here, and as you were to use help or investigate particular fields, you're going to run across a couple of issues. First of all, it may say that this particular field is for reference only. If that's true, it's just for slicing and dicing, and you can use it pretty much however you use. The generalized codes, if a part or a field is generalized code controlled, it simply means that you have put a control on how you're going to enter information into that particular field. And another word of caution, don't use an element in QED for something that it wasn't intended to. That's a good rule of thumb to come across. So let's look at the item master menu system. Item master menu starts off with 1.4.1, and you can see there's 1.4.3, 5, 7, 9, etc. There's item site records, and these are put into QED to allow the menu security to have these menus available to particular groups of people in your organization: planning, engineering, accounting. So if there's accounting information, they're probably going to go into the item cost maintenance. If there's engineering data, they may be going into the item data maintenance. So this series of menus is controlled by what we call roles and permissions. And we don't have time to talk about roles and permissions. It's a pretty complicated subject. So Alex and I are working on a roles and permission webinar that we'll give later in the summer to explain segregation of duties, configured screens, menu selection field, security, etc., etc. So once you've got your security set up, then the first place you go is into the item master file, 1.4.1. This is the item frame, and the first thing you're going to come across is the item number. The item number is the unique identifier. The rule is one part number for one thing. Not many things for one part number or many part numbers for one thing. It's unique identification. There are various kinds of part numbers that you can use. Significant, that's where every digit in the 18 field means something, and regrettably, when the guy that invented the significance leaves the company, everybody forgets why it was named that way. You can have semi-significant part numbers where either a prefix or some 3-4 digit number precedes a part identifier as an item and may have something to do with a code, or there's a random number. I remember random numbers, I think they're the best, simply because when I was a expediter back at Beckman in the early 70s, I remember the first part I ever went to expedite at our board shop, 663, 627. Now, I remember that part number simply because of the circumstances around it. It doesn't necessarily mean that that had any significance or semi-significance. So you're going to put in an item number, then you're going to have a unit of measure. And we'll talk a little bit about unit of measure a little bit later. Then there's the description field, and typically we use noun, adjective, adjective format for that. I don't like adjective, adjective nouns. It's hard to look up things. And then there's a second description field that provides some additional or supplementary or overflow values. And that's okay, but it prints on, it says most reports, but some reports, documents, as space permits. So I would be cautious with the use of the second description. Now we come to 1.4.3, or the item data, and this is the static information for the system. Product lines allow us to group products together. This associates a general ledger account with the groups of products. We'll have another webinar on the 15th of May that talks more specifically about costs associated in QED. So we'll talk a lot more about product lines when we get to May 15th. Then there's the added, I'm kind of flying over those particular fields that don't have anything to do with MRP, but they're there. You should know what they are. There's item type, optional code for summarizing categories. The status code, this can have a significant impact on MRP itself, and we'll talk about the item status code and the restrictions associated with that item status in just a second. There's a group code, another optional. Then there's a drawing field, which doesn't have anything to do with MRP directly. It's an optional field for reference only. However, you need to understand the impact of that field on planning. I've seen purchasing order the wrong material because the drawing field has not been updated properly. So it's not a direct control, but it needs to be looked at. Then there's some more reference fields, items, drawings, size, and price break category. Then we get into 1.5 or 1.4.5, item inventory data. So you've got your ABC class, which doesn't have anything to do with MRP. It's got to do with cycle counting. However, as we noted, cycle counting is the tool that you use to have the correct quantity on hand. So ABC code, Lot serial control, this also can have a significant impact on how MRP works. If it's blank, they're not lot controlled. I noticed from the registration questions that there's a number of us who have lot and serial control, so that may affect how MRP works. There's the site. We mentioned that's how you do MRP. There's the location code if you decide that that's a default for your process. Location type, this simply says you must have this part number with the same location type going into the same location type on the location master. So there's another control for the part. If you auto lot parts, you can define those in 1.2.13 in lot group maintenance. We particularly use 95% of our parts are a lot control, so we have lot groups assigned to that. This is for reference only. This average interval and cycle count interval have to do with that cycle count process, so nothing particular with MRP. The shelf life causes MRP in QAD some issues, because as parts expire or lots expire in MRP, MRP has no mechanism to recognize that expiration date and take that into account in the calculation of the projected quantity on hand. However, I have, and a couple of other people that I know have submitted enhancements requests to have that process actually codified into QAD, and I know of companies that have done that codification on their own so that it takes into account those expired shelf lives. There's single lot allocation, which can have effect on MRP. Key item, if you want all parts available for an order. The PO status, its active flag, the work order status flag and its active flag also can have an effect on how MRP recognizes those quantities as they are received. And then there's the memo type. Now, this is relatively new to the EE version of MRP, or excuse me, of QAD. But this says that if there is a value in here, it's going to place either sales order or purchase order related lines as memo types, and therefore they have no visibility to MRP. There's the 1.5 shipping data, not used for MRP. Now we get to the item planning. Item planning fields that have to do with MRP are master scheduling. This allows you to identify those parts that are master scheduled. So if you have end items plus those types of products that are subject to independent demand, you can code those. That's a good way to keep track of them. This is probably one of the more important fields. Do you want MRP to plan orders for this? So if that's checked, MRP is going to go through that order processing. We talked about time fences in MRP in the July webinar. So if you want to, you can go back and review that. But that basically says QAD is not going to allow MRP to plan anything inside of that time fence. MRP required. There is, this is an internal system generated field that is keyed by various events or circumstances. If you change a lead time, if you close an order short, MRP is going to recognize that and that will be checked yes, and that would indicate that you need to explode or rerun one of the net change processes. Order policy, critical to MRP. It's either blank. If it's blank, MRP doesn't plan it. Even if you've got that planned order checked, if the order policy is blank, doesn't work. Or period order quantity, fixed order quantity, lot for lot, or one time only. I don't know a lot of people that use one time only. So primarily POQ, FOQ, and lot for lot. This is the order quantity, critical again to MRP. This is the lot sizing that MRP is going to do to that projected quantity on hand. So you're going to always order in that quantity. Batch, we'll talk about batch in just a second. So you'll notice that you can't update batch quantity in 1.4.7 or 1.4.17, the item site planning. So we'll talk about how we do that in just a second. Order period, if the order policy is POQ, then you need a order period. And this basically tells MRP that you should go out X number of periods and accumulated gross requirements to make that planned order release or lot sized planned order. Then safety stock. Safety stock is used to guard against fluctuations in supply and demand. If you have a value in there, you're basically going to raise the zero net available line in QAD up to that stock level. So the old rule is that if you put safety stock in, you just bought that inventory. So it's a high cost to the organization. So you need to be cautious about how you use that. Safety time sets back the planned order due date to the planned order release date for just this particular part on planned orders. So if you want safety buffer in there, you can put in that safety lead time. Reorder point normally means that you're going to use the formula of demand through lead time plus safety stock, and MRP is not going to use that. Item rev comes from the default of the item master in the item data. Then issue policy simply means that you're not going to issue this with work orders. You can still plan it with MRP if you want to. There's buyer code, which is a handy little tool to be able to group various action messages from MRP together. Supplier doesn't have anything to do primarily with MRP unless you're using the advanced repetitive capability to split or assign a percentage of planned orders to various suppliers, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. There's the PO site that you're going to do if you have multiple sites. This is critical to MRP, purchase manufacturing. If it's an M, it's a make part. If it's a P, it's a purchased item. The configured type is to be able to use assemble to order or kit type functionality. Doesn't affect MRP. Inspection, if you've got inspection lead time, manufacturing lead time, and purchase lead time, that is the difference between what MRP plans for due date receipt versus due date release. So those are critical. They should be reviewed often and accurately to make MRP work properly. There's cumulative lead time, which you can calculate. It just is a visual of what's in the system. Then there's available promise, family available promise horizon, which don't have anything to do with MRP, but has to do with promising product to customers. Run sequence 1 and 2. If you use L as the make buy code, which is a product line for repetitive, that would allow you to define those run sequences. Then you've got phantom. Phantom, there's two types of phantoms. A global phantom, which means that you're going to blow through this particular assembly and take its components up to the next level for every part in the system. We'll look at a local phantom on the bill of material, which means that's just for that particular value. Then minimum order quantity, maximum order quantity, and order multiple allow us to modify the planned orders. Minimum always order. Maximum just gives you a message that you're planning in advance or over some order, predetermined order quantity. And then order multiple says you're always going to order, say, in pallet levels. There's auth-based yield, which allows the system to run MRP based on the yields calculated in the product structure. This, along with the yield percent, is somewhat complicated, but it allows MRP to do a much better job of calculating needs based on orders. There are yield percentages at the item level, and what that does is it adds a message, a scrap requirement message, to the gross requirements in MRP, and we'll look at that in just a second. So this increases the requirement for the part. Run and setup time are just informational. EMT, enterprise material transfer, both type and processing, don't have anything to do with MRP, as the network code that does have something to do with DRP, but not MRP. Then routings, and finally the BOM formula code. And we'll talk about BOM formula code when we get to that particular session. So there's also a new field called replenishment method, and replenishment method is basically how you're going to order. Is it going to be Kanban? Is it going to be orders? So you can set that to tell QAD how you're going to plan for that. So you got 1.4.1, 1.4.3, 1.4.5, 1.4.7. And if you have multiple sites, then you're going to have to use 1.4.17 or 16 item site inventory or 18 item site cost, or if you're using service and support, the item site service level. And what that means is that this data, the same data you're going to use up for 1.4.7, needs to be specific to that site that you're planning on. And just a word of caution, you need to understand how those values are going to update MRP, because if you've got a 1.4.1 record in the item master file and you don't have 1.4.17, but yet you explode in 1.4.17, it's going to take the value from 1.4.1. So you got to be a little bit careful when you use these item site records. Cost doesn't have anything to do with MRP, but it's ultimately critical. As we say, the accountants rule our lives, and you want to make sure that what you're processing is going to not only give you the correct standard cost roll-up process, but also the value of transactions as they occur in the inventory module based on the product line. And again, we'll talk about that much more in May. So, other functions in MRP or QAD that affect MRP, we talked about the unit of measure. In 1.13, you can set alternate units of measure. This is basically the stocking unit of measure. And remember, QAD, MRP always plans in stocking units of measure. However, you can order in purchasing against a purchase unit of measure. And then you define the relationship between the stocking unit of measure and the alternate unit of measure. In this particular case, we stock as eaches, we purchase it in cases, and there are 1,200 eaches in each case. So when you receive that purchase order in 5.13.1, it's going to automatically take that purchase order quantity and convert it to a stocking unit of measure. There's the item status code. We talked about item status codes. This can help define the life cycle of the planning through design, production, obsolescence. This particular example gives us a reserved item number, and there are various transactions that are restricted against a particular item status code. So if you finally release this into production, you change the item status code to prod, and in prod you wouldn't have any restricted transaction code, so you could process whatever you want. But here in a reserve status, you can't sell it, you can't cut a work order, et cetera, et cetera. So those are very handy to restrict the activity on a particular part. There's the item status, which again, or the inventory status code, which again can define how a particular lot is going to be affected in inventory. You can define available, nettable, or overissuable. Nettable is what MRP recognizes, and again, you can restrict various transactions in the system as to whether they're going to be allowed to transfer, sell, issue, however you want to do that. So bills of material. We looked at bills of material a lot more in the June and July webinar, but just a quick recap. Here I've got a graphical representation of a bill of material. So you've got A, B goes into A, C goes into A, D goes into A, E goes into B, etc., etc. And you can represent that as a matrix if you want, but in terms of QAD's MRP system and all the MRP systems, it is simply the parent component relationship. When we choose 15.5, the place where we build product structures, you'll see that all you really have visibility of in one transaction is a single parent component relationship. Now, there are some typical pieces of information on BOMs: the parent item number, the component, quantity required, scrap factors, effectivity dates that we'll look at when we get to the example in QAD. So what MRP is going to try and do is it's going to calculate the number, in this case, of G's needed to make A's. So if you look at the product structure, there's A required 2B, B requires 4 E's, E requires 4 or 16 G's, C requires 8 G's, so there's 24 G's that are required to make an A. That then becomes the gross requirement at the low-level code of the particular part number. So the low-level code defines the lowest level at which you will find a particular part in any bill of material in the system, and it says, okay, now I can accumulate gross requirements. And so this gross requirement will go into the MRP grid, as we'll see. There's purchase components, in this case F, G, and H, and that is defined by or controlled by that purchase manufacturer code, where you've got M's for A, B, C, E, and P make-buy codes for G, F, and H, and D. So that's just how MRP or bills of material work. You can look at these as various formats of reporting, single or multi-level, but just remember that different formatted reports are simply printouts of those parent component relationships. QAD does not, and MRP in all ERP systems does not have a parent and a list of components. It's got a parent and a child, a parent and a child, a parent and a child. The importance of bills of material are that it defines your structure, how the part is going to manufacture. It allows this time phasing that Ollie and Joe Orlicki and them developed back in the 1970s as the basis of MRP. It's how we cost along with the routing. So the accountants are always interested in that. And then what gets forecasted. Remember, we forecast at independent level. Normally it's 0 level, but also anything that's exposed to independent demand. And it defines the build process. So this helps us define routings, work instructions, etc. The product structure code is a tool in QAD that allows you to build product structures for other than the part number. If you build a product structure for an item, if you look in 1.4.7, that would mean that that BOM formula code was blank. But if you create a new product code, you could tell the system that in a particular site, you have a different product or bill of material code. In another site, you may have another product code, and these could be built with different lists or numbers of components. So if we look at product structure maintenance, we see the product part parent. There's the component. We've got a reference field. So this could be used if you've got more than one component, such as printed circuit boards, that kind of thing. Start effectivity date. Oh my God, use that. We first started our implementation of QAD without start and end effectivity dates, and it was a catastrophe. So you really need to have your start and end effectivity dates. System doesn't allow you to overlap them. And then this is the quantity per. So this is really what makes MRP work, is this quantity per parent, or quantity per child as it goes into the parent. There's structure type. Structure types indicate how the component is used. Is an alternate. You can use documents. Here's that local phantom that I talked about, where just this parent-component relationship is a blow-through in MRP. Or you can have planning, family bills, optional bills, those kinds of things. There's the start and stop effectivity or marks field. Scrap, here is where MRP is going to increase the gross requirement of the component, but it really doesn't show in MRP. It just shows that that is a gross requirement of the parent. So you've got to be a little bit careful with that. There's a lead time offset that you can set for this particular parent-child relationship. There's an operation, so you can have parts issued there. Sequence numbers, you can renumber pick lists. There's forecast percentage and option group, and a process, which is used primarily for backward exploded backflush. So just a quick word about 13.5 in the .NET version. I do not like this version. You can see that it gives an item, a parent, and then it lists all of the components. I typically like to go in, do the drop down for the desktop version, and then you get back to the normal parent component relationship that we saw in the previous field. One of the reasons I don't like it is because we use formulas a lot, and for some reason QAD decided not to do a .NET navigation for 15.5, but they did it for 13.5. So it's always a nuisance. So I always go back and make the 13.5 a standard desktop application. 13.5 allows us to have alternate structures, so you can build the same part number in different sites with a different set of components. And as you cut the work order, and when you will see, you can use one of those processes. Formulas, first of all, you have to define that a particular BOM code is a formula and define its batch size. Then in formula maintenance, basically the same as 13.5, but with the addition of this thing called the order type, which allows you to define the child-parent relationship in terms of quantity per by either batch size, percentage of batch, or if you just have it blank, it's going to be the same as just a quantity per in 13.5. So that's very helpful to develop those formulas. If you want to change, and we mentioned this when we looked at 1.4.17, this batch quantity appears in 1.4.7 and you cannot change it. And from a costing point of view, we want to make sure that the order quantity is equal to the batch quantity, because the order quantity is what amortizes the setup value across the lot size. And so you want those two to be the same, so the cost accountants are happy. If you change the batch size, or you change the order quantity, you need to do 15.9, which in this case we're going to change from 203 to 150, and you can see you now get a report out that gives you the difference between what it was and what it is, and then you should go back into 15.5 and make sure that formula maintenance matches what the engineers or scientists define as that parent-component relationship, and then go back into 1.4.7 and make sure that the order quantity then matches that batch quantity. Then MRP is going to be happy. There's pegging and where used. Where used is simply looking at all of the parent items for a particular child, and pegging goes into MRP and does that same kind of function, only it allows you to look at the sources of demand for a particular item's gross requirements. That can be done either at a single level, multi-level, or summarized. I did contact support, and in EE there is no multi-level. There used to be a multi-level pegging function in the old SE. It was originally developed by Lagatum over in Europe, but they didn't incorporate that into the latest versions. So you can go into 2314, which we'll see, and you can peg up if you want to, or we just created a basic pegging reporting out of mrp.deet _deet table, and simply here you can see the item, the type of demand, and then you can source it to whatever that is. So that's a kind of a pegging report. So let's just talk a little bit about MRP as we go through some of the examples. Here we've got a lead time of item for this, or lead time of 2 weeks for this item. We've got 5 periods across the horizon and 10 quantity on hand. So gross requirements, we've got 35 out here in period 5 for sales order, customers, forecast. Then you've got scheduled receipts. In this case, we've got 20 coming into inventory in period 2, and that could be a work order, purchase order, supplier schedule, however you do that. Then you start with quantity on hand, and now you drive forward to calculate the projected quantity on hand. So here we've got 10 at the end of period 1, 20 coming in into period 2, so our projected available is 30. That carries to period 3 and period 4. Now we've got a negative 5 in period 5. That means we've got a net requirement. We offset that by, we plan a receipt into inventory by that. We offset it by the planned order release, and it comes back into inventory. So that's basically what MRP is doing with the calculations. And you can see here, if we've got this part number 1, it goes into X, 1 goes into Y, and it's also got a master schedule. We can go through that same accumulation of gross requirements. We can look at the quantity on hand and do the projected available quantity on hand out into the future, take into account that 100. And you can see that MRP is just going to go out. It's going to encounter a negative projected quantity on hand in period 7. It's going to plan an order for that period. That period is going to be offset by the lot size, and that is going to come back in. So that's basically how MRP is going to work. And if you want a more elaborate explanation of that, you can go back to the July webinar. There's 3 basic ways to identify or recalculate MRP. You can do it by 23.1 net change, which means you're only going to look at those items that are affected by change. There also, if you remember back in the discussion of 1.4.7, you've got MRP required. If that checkbox is done, then that indicates that you need to do at least one of these regeneration menus. So 23.1, 23.2 regenerates every part number in the system, wipes out all planned orders, recalculates every 3, and then selective just does that particular part number. You got to be a little bit careful because it doesn't do parents or childs of that, so you need to be aware of how that explosion process works. So let's look at how processing of particular items works in terms of MRP. So first of all, purchase orders are obviously supply that's going to come in, and we'll look at purchase order maintenance and purchase order Receipts, this is 23.14 MRP report before a purchase order is placed. And let's relate that to our little MRP grid, and you can see the gross requirements, scheduled receipts, projected quantity on hand, and planned order receipts. So if you were to be like some people, they like to see horizontal examples. I like particularly the vertical, because the vertical gives me more information regarding MRP, but it's a choice. If you want to look at creating a purchase order, you go into 5.7. This creates an open order. It increases the scheduled receipt for the purchase item and can reduce or eliminate a planned order for that. If you go into the purchase order line for that particular item, you add the item, the order quantity, and the due date. And what that's going to do is it's going to increase the scheduled receipt row in MRP. You can then go in and receive that purchase order. So here you're going to do 5.13.1. This shows as a receipt in 3.21.2 transactions and moves from scheduled receipt to quantity on hand. So you can see now it's disappeared from the scheduled receipt and you've increased the quantity on hand. From a work orders point of view, you cut the work order, you can modify the bill, issue the components, print the work order receipt or the print list, and then do a work order receipt. So here is a detail on a part before. Here we're going to cut the work order, in this case for 55,555, and we're going to make it an R part number and a due date right here. And you can see what that does is it increases the scheduled receipt for that item, and here's the work order that we cut for that. We can now go in, if you need to, you can modify the component of this item. So this is a component to the work order. And here is the gross requirement that's created by that. If you go into 16.13.1, you can modify that allocation. And in MRP, you'll see that increased allocation in the gross requirements. You then go in and issue the work order or issue the components into the work order. That gives you your ISS-WO transactions. You then do the work order receipt. And in that particular case, you're going to reduce the scheduled receipt and increase the quantity on hand. If you do that with sales order, you're going to create a sales order. In this case, 66 for this particular item. Here you can see that that is now part of the gross requirement. And here's the sales order line. If I ship that, and I'm just going to use the old 7.9.15, you can see that it's eliminated the sales order itself and reduced the quantity on hand. So now you've got an increase in the accounts receivable portion of the accounting. So you can track all this in 3.21.2. You can see the particular transactions that have occurred. This is going to give you all of the transactions that we just went through. And you should know how each one of these transactions affect the operation of MRP. So there are 70 of the transactions that occur in QAD, and 21 of those, these listed, have some kind of effect on MRP. So you should understand all of these transactions and what they can do to your 23.14 or 23.17 process. So before we end, I'd like to just talk a little bit about this thing called DDMRP. As we mentioned, MRP has been around for about 50 years. It's actually older, a little bit older than I am. And so, as indicated, all MRPs, it's the mainstay of SAP and Infor and IFS and QAD, and having been invented back in the 50s, in 2011, a lady named Carol Patak and Chad Smith rewrote the third edition of Orlikay's MRP, or Material Requirements Planning, and introduced this concept of demand-driven MRP. So here's a classic MRP example. Sales operation drives on the master schedule. So MRP is from the end item and explodes down through the product structure, as we've seen. But however, MRP can cause issues. If anybody has read Ellie Goldrath, The Gold, I highly recommend anybody who is in planning read that book. It can cause the variations in supply and demand variations can cause what's called the bullwhip effect. So you get masses of variations, and MRP then is a very nervous sort of a process. And typically spreadsheets are used to compensate for this, but DDMRP is a concept that uses MRP, DRP, Lean, Theory of Constraints, Six Sigma, and has these 5 components that allow you to define what are called strategic decoupling positions. You then define buffer profiles and levels, and those are dynamically adjusted through the processing of the DDMRP. And then you drive the manufacturing organization and purchasing through these demand-driven planning processes. And this is done through these buffer and level definitions. So here you've got a part number, and you define a safety value, a primary coverage, and an order frequency or size based on some group setting or buffer profiles, individual properties, so that you then define for each strategically decoupled point in the manufacturing system a new buffer point. And this then generates what is called a net flow equation. So the buffer status and supply order generation through the daily application of this net flow equation, which is basically the DDMRP equivalent of a planned order release. So quantity on hand plus open supply minus, and here it is, only qualified order demand, not forecast. So what that does is it calculates this net flow position and then generates a supply order to get us back up to the desired level of buffer. So if you look at DDRP with these decoupled buffers, you go through the implementation process and define these buffer points and their buffer levels, and now ERP can run with this DDMRP system for both scheduling and execution. So there's some good benefits to this. Improve customer service. You can reduce the lead time. One I like is right-sized inventory. That's one of the issues with MRP that we've always recognized. And then lowest supply chain costs is you're getting rid of a lot of safety stock. And it's basically easy to use for planners and buyers. Plus Dynasis, which is the QAD version of demand-driven institutes compliance requirements, says that we are now certified. So anybody that's got demand or Dynasis system can do this DDMRP process. So I think DDMRP is probably one of the tools that's going to be the future of ERP planning as we go across. So let's review what we did. We looked at items, we looked at BOMs and formulas, we looked at the impacts on MRP, order quantities, purchase sales, inventory, and talked a little bit about DDMRP. So if you've got any questions, send me an email, or I'll turn it back to Denise.
Fair enough, fair enough. Well, thank you. We're going to switch gears now and close out because we are starting to lose a few folks. So if you'll bear with me for one more minute, we just wanted to remind you, as Don had mentioned on a couple of occasions, we do have a couple of upcoming webinars, and Don will be back again in May for Show Me the Money for supply chain players, as well as June for QAD variances. Registration is open for both of these, and as always, links are available at the bottom of all of our communications and on our website as well, of course. Don, before we do a final wrap, is there anything else we really need to squeeze in before we go?
Just the statement that if you have a specific question, please send me an email, dhl@32soft, and we'll get back with you two as a particular. I know that MRP is a challenging tool, and it takes a lot of smart people to make it run properly. So best of luck with your implementations.
Thank you, Don. Thanks a lot. And as a reminder, shoot us any kind of questions, and we will include those for everyone when we post the replay. To wrap up, let's just plan to corral the core of QAD and know that we're here to help. Your attendance today shows that you are on your way, or maybe have done exactly that. So thank you very much for your time today, everyone, and happy holidays to all those celebrating this weekend. We hope you will join us again next month. Have a great day, everybody.
Thank you again.